Welcome back. And thank you to whoever sourced the coffee at break time. It is with great pleasure, and it is my pleasure to introduce to you our next speaker, who is one of the foremost learning disability nurses across the UK and internationally, and one of only 2 professors of learning disability nursing in the whole of the UK. So hopefully her and the other person never go on a plane together or anything like that, because there's just the 2 and we protect them widely. But Ruth has been a leading light and part of the Strengthening the Commitment journey right from the beginning, and I thank you for that, Ruth. And she's going to talk to us today about research, and I'm sure make it exciting and meaningful to us all. And as you can see, it's listen, believe, do. Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you. I've got 2 major challenges that I've got to face with this. One is to try and keep within time on a subject I could speak for hours about. And the other, and you probably can all help me with this, is not to step too far to the right, because otherwise I fall off of the stage. So if you see me veering this way, please sort of start going like this. Okay, a couple of things by way of explanation. On your programmes you will have seen it says listen, believe, do, and you might have thought, well, what on earth is that about? That will become clear, hopefully, as I go through the presentation. You will also see on the slide here that it talks about research by people with learning disabilities, and you might sort of be thinking quite rightly, well, if it's research by people with learning disabilities, what's she doing there talking about it? What this was very much a team effort. We worked together, people with learning disabilities and people who weren't given the label learning disabilities. We've worked together over a long time. This, what you see here, is the end of a 3-year research project, but the end of a 10-year journey. And basically what we decided was, because it's quite expensive and quite time consuming to go to conferences, but we really wanted to get this word out as far as possible. So we agreed that as a team, different people would go to different places. In a couple of weeks' time, 2 of the co-researchers who worked on the project are going to Croatia to present this, and I've come to West Brom today. I'm sure that I've got the best of the sort of deal. But say this is a 3-year project. We've got 3 partners: New Pathways, which is an organisation that provides post-sexual abuse counselling, RCT People First, which I get so used to saying RCT, and then people get very confused about research because of randomised controlled trials. It's the abbreviation we use locally for one of the areas, which is Rhondda Cynon Taf, so you can see why we use RCT. And the university that I work for, and we were funded by the big lottery. This gives you some indication of most of the team. We're not all there. It was very much a team effort, people working together, people taking on different roles, using everybody's experience and expertise. So, researching together, what does that actually mean? Now, if you look at a lot of research, particularly historical research, people with learning disabilities have tended to be, at best, the sort of subjects of other people's research. Sometimes they've actually been objects of research by other people. And their views and experiences have never really been brought to the forefront. That started to change, but also what started to change is people with learning disabilities actually taking an active role in driving the research agenda. I mean, I'm one of the, joining the sort of theme of the day, I'm one of those old nurses that has been around for 30 plus years, and I can safely say this is probably one of the most exciting things I've ever done. It has been a great privilege to work on this project. The idea for research came from people with learning disabilities who said, we want to do research, we want it to be about abuse, because really, you know, it's a problem for us and our friends. And we don't really talk about it much, and we want to know more about it. So we worked together to get funding, and that took a lot of effort. We had the usual being turned down. And when we got turned down, actually it was our colleagues with learning disabilities who said to us, right, who are we going to go to next? Who are we going to get money from? So we kept going, and we got the funding. It enabled us to actually employ 3 people with learning disabilities part-time as co-researchers. They worked half a day a week for 3 years. And we've also had a research advisory group that was actually chaired by one of my colleagues with learning disabilities. And I have to say it was probably one of the best controlled and organised meetings I went to. Kept to time, kept on focus, was fantastic. But they made a lot of the key decisions as we went through, and I'll say a little bit about some of those as I tell you about the project. What we know about abuse from the literature is that generally disabled people are at greater risk of abuse than other people. But also there's some evidence that within the disability group, people with learning disabilities are at greater risk than other people with disabilities. But, and there's always a but, if you look at a lot of the research that's been done, it's either counting how many times abuse occurs, or it's looking at attitudes of staff or awareness and things like that, or it's looking at people with learning disabilities being taught. It's not really about, so what are their thoughts about this? You know, how do we work with people? How do we support people? So we came up with 4 questions. What do people with learning disabilities understand by abuse? What are their views about abuse? What help and support do they need to keep safe? You know, unfortunately, we have tended over the years to focus more on trying to think about what do we do if somebody's abused, rather than trying to keep people safe, trying to help people take more control over their lives and actually empower them to keep themselves safe. Unfortunately, with the best plans in the world, probably some people are going to be abused. That's unfortunately a very sad fact of life. But when they are, what's the best ways to actually give people some help? So we did the study. We gathered information by 3 different means. We developed questionnaires. I should say before each of these, we did training around questionnaires, we did training around focus groups and interviews and looked at what was required. But we put together questionnaires using obviously pictures, symbols and easy read language. We tested them out with people from a different area to see whether or not they were okay, and we then finally agreed on what we were going to do. Individual interviews, what happened there was one of the co-researchers and a supporter co-facilitated an individual interview. And then we had focus groups, and they were held, and we had obviously a group of people, but we had activities to try and actually focus people's thoughts on things. As I said, I can only give very brief information about this, but please do stop me and I can tell you lots more if you want. One of the sort of, I suppose, innovations was how do we ask people to take part? We felt that it was very unfair to say to people, come and have an interview about abuse, and then say, thank you, goodbye, and leave them to go off into the great beyond. So what we did was in the proposal, we actually got funding to hold a 3-day residential event. We invited people to come along to that, and we did the questionnaires for everybody there, we did the interviews, and we did focus groups while people were there. In the end, 49 people came along. They had the activities that I've talked about, the research activities, but they also had a variety of other activities going on. So they were able to do things like, it was close to Christmas, so there was some craft classes doing Christmassy things. The one that I was really upset about missing, because I was doing some of the interviews, was there was chocolate making. But I did manage to sneak one afterwards. But there was lots of different activities, and what we did was we got student nurses to actually organise some of that and facilitate that. Some learning disability student nurses, but also mental health student nurses. And it was great to see them take, you know, things like leadership, things like organisational skills, communication, all of those were developed as well during those sort of 3 days. So it was a way in which research can engage people and actually help people learn an awful lot of skills that perhaps people don't always think about in terms of research. We sent out the postal questionnaire after we had the residential, and overall 107 people with learning disabilities took part. That was 47 people attending the residential event, and the others obviously via the postal. So what did we find? Perhaps before I just go through this, I ought to say that the analysis was done as a team again. Sometimes if you look at some of the literature, people sort of say, oh, analysis, abstract, bit difficult for people with learning disabilities, I don't know. Don't underestimate people. We had a fantastic time doing this. We had to do first of all, we had a training session. And again, it was for me, I had to think about, well, how do I convey analysis in a way which people can understand and we can all access? In the end, we used the analogy of a jigsaw puzzle, that all of us have done jigsaw puzzles, and what do? Well, you look at it all, you sort out the bits with straight edges and you put them to one side, you find the corners, and then you look for colours, and somehow you move it around a bit and you get a picture at the end. And that's how we understood analysis. We had to take this information, we had to look for patterns, we then had to put it together to try and make a picture of what people were thinking about abuse. One co-researcher with his personal assistant took responsibility for doing the questionnaires and very conscientiously sat there and tallied these 107 questionnaires until he got the totals. And the other two worked individually on the interviews and the focus groups, developing their own ways of doing that. One person used colour coding. Another person thought, okay, I can do cut and paste and put it into questions and things like that. But at the end, we had data that we could use, and then we discussed it as a team. And the value of having the insights of people with learning disabilities in that analysis was absolutely fantastic, because they have experiences and insights I don't have. Yes, I've researched, yes, I can look at this information, but they could talk about what some of these things were actually meaning. So in terms of abuse, people knew about lots of different types of abuse, all the usual ones in terms of physical, sexual, psychological. People also included things about racial abuse. And what was interesting was a couple of people throwing up issues about how they'd been abused by some people because of their learning disability and by other people because of their race and their ethnicity, and how those actually came together, and it was quite difficult. They also talked about domestic abuse. Just because you have a learning disability doesn't mean to say that you're not going to be abused by a partner. And one woman said, well, it was my fault, I deserved it. And you think, how many times, if you look at some of the domestic violence literature, do you hear that coming from women? So, do people have more in common with other people with learning disabilities, or perhaps sometimes with other women in that situation? Things which we need to think about. What really, I suppose, didn't shock me, but worried me, was not everyone is told about abuse. Some people said that they'd seen it, they'd had courses, perhaps with People First or something like that. Some people said, well, I've seen it on the television. It might have been a programme which was helpful, but we all know that sometimes the way information is presented in that context is not always a good reflection of what happens. But what was most worrying was some said they'd only learnt about it when their friends were abused and their friends told them, or they'd only learnt about it when they were abused. How do you protect yourself if you don't know what you're protecting yourself from? What are people's views about abuse? Lots and lots of strong feelings. I've only pulled out a few here. Understandably, people feeling angry, people feeling embarrassed. People who are embarrassed aren't likely to report it to other people and to get the help and support they need. People feeling upset. But one which came through probably about 5 or 6 times was variations on this theme of it makes you feel as if life's not worth living. It makes you feel as if you should give up. You might hurt yourself. You might harm yourself. Again, I think an area we need to think very carefully about how we do support people. In terms of what help and support do people need to keep safe, they said learning to speak up. That came through from a lot of people, which you might say, well, okay, they went to self-advocacy groups, they probably would say that. But my co-researchers said, well, that's great, but what if other people don't listen? And they were saying that quite often people say about abuse, nobody listens, nobody believes you, nobody does anything. If that happens to you, you're less likely to report it another time. Another thing was making sure that people know where you are. Sounds very, very sensible, but hands up, how many of you would feel comfortable with making somebody else aware where you are all the time as adults? Funny enough, not many hands. And as, again, one of my co-researchers pointed out, I think that's more for the benefit of the staff than it is for us. So we need to think about how do we respect people's rights for independence, but at the same time make sure that people are safe, or as safe as they can be. Staying away from nasty people, again, good advice. But what happens if the nasty people actually are living next door to you? And how do you stay away from them? What happens if it's other people actually in the same house as you, where people are living with people who have difficult behaviours? How do they get away from them then? And having someone to talk to who can sort things out for you. What's the best ways to help people who've been abused? People being there for them. Again, eminently sensible. People believing them. It doesn't always happen, and there's a couple of other studies as well where I've come across this, where people have sort of said, nobody believed me. Support for the person to live their life. What this was about was where you have somebody who has experienced abuse, in an effort to try and keep them safe, sometimes people almost like put them in a cocoon and they're not allowed to do anything. Because they were abused in such and such a setting, well, they can't go to that setting anymore, or they can't do this activity or that activity, and they find their world sort of shrinking. To be told what's happening, people said, I reported it, I don't know what happened, nobody came back to me. So what needs to happen? Basically, it's everybody's problem. Everybody has got a role to play. We need to check how policies are working. Remember, across the UK, we do have policies, and in some areas we have legislation which should be protecting people from abuse, should be safeguarding, and yet, people's experiences are still quite difficult. We need to make sure that people with learning disabilities get the information and education that they need. Generally, people need to be more aware of abuse. And that's not just, people within services. I think, we're talking here about society. A lot of the abuse was things like happening on buses, being abused on buses, being abused in public places and things like that as well. If people are abused, counselling and support needs to be available at the right time. Unfortunately, counselling in this area is very, very limited. If people do get access to it, it's normally quite a long way down the line, by which time some of the issues which they're facing have maybe become almost like chronic problems. If you look at some of the literature on self-harm, you look at some of the literature around other sort of mental health problems, if you track back, quite often there is some kind of history of abuse which was not recognised or responded to at the appropriate time. And, you might expect a researcher to say more research is needed. Now, this is where my co-researchers were extremely helpful. I sat there thinking, oh, right, okay, so we've got to get this together. How do we pull this together? What are the key messages? And they just got it. They want people to listen. They want people to believe other people when they say they've been abused. And they want people to do something to change things. And so that's really the sort of key messages which have come through, which we've been trying to sort of get out there in terms of posters, in terms of various other sort of formats, and I'll show you one in a minute. But basically, those are the messages. So what have we done? And I did check. I think all of this is going to be uploaded, hopefully after the event. So you should be able to access this if you want to download it. We've got written reports. The reports, basically, there's two aspects to it. One is about doing the research together, and one is really the findings around abuse. Now, the easy read version, because to make it more accessible, we've actually split that. So one is about the findings, one is about actually how we research together. But those are available in English and Welsh versions. And we also have a full report, which brings the two together, and a summary. So you can actually access those from that link. You can download them. We want people to read it. We want people to use it. We want people to act on it. What we've also done, and this resource is then, you've got the link if you want to follow it up, is try to get some information for people with learning disabilities. All the research which is written with the exception of Nora Fry Research Centre at Bristol, that they did it for a while. They had a plain facts series. But how many research reports get translated, or how many research papers that are published actually get put into easy read format for people with learning disabilities? If they do people use those and help people with learning disabilities access them? And basically what we did was to do an accessible literature review around abuse. One of my colleagues took papers. She did contact the authors of a lot of them and ask them for their easy read versions, and it was a case of answer came there none. But what she did was transfer them into an easy read format. They were discussed with people with learning disabilities to see what they thought about this. And that was quite interesting because one woman in particular got very, very angry within the session, which was about men with learning disabilities who sexually abuse women with learning disabilities. And she said, why did I not know this? You know, as researchers, as professionals, we've known this for years and years, but why did I not know this? And her anger was that she felt that had she known this, she might have been able to protect herself better, but also her friends who were men with learning disabilities, she could have made sure that they knew and that they didn't get themselves into trouble and that they had the information. So on this sort of particular part of the website, you will find a lot of these papers. We have got, there's the easy read version, there's the commentary where people have obviously talked about it. And with some of them, we've also got voice clips as well, so that, you know, if you want to use them with people who find it difficult to read, you could use the voice clips as well. So I would encourage you to visit it and use it and support people to use it. We have a Facebook group called Listen, Believe, Do. It's standing at the moment, I think I looked at this morning, it's about 770 plus. I would love to go home tonight with it gone over the 800 mark. So I'd encourage people to join up. Basically what we're asking people to do there is to post their pledge in relation to what they're going to do to try and listen, believe and do. If you don't do that, you're still welcome to sign up to see what other people are doing and what other information is coming through. I think music seems to be a theme for the morning. You'll be pleased to know this is not me singing. One of our, it's a long story as to how we found the person to do this, but anyway, the person who did this is a young local singer who was more than happy to use a song that he'd written, which is called, funny enough, I Believe. You know, things do happen by lucky coincidence sometimes. And basically, what you'll find on this YouTube clip is his sort of soundtrack to it, but also some of the facts and figures, and also some of the people doing the signs for Listen and Believe Do. So, you know, I'd encourage you to look at it, but also please use it for things like training and things like that, to try and get other people to act on it. We're making a lot of presentations. We've managed to get a small amount of money to enable a couple of the researchers to provide training for people with learning disabilities as co-researchers. And we've got an MRes student starting in a couple of weeks, hopefully, to look at more around what support people need. What can you do? Join the Facebook page. If you put in Listen, Believe, Do, that will find it for you. You can post information on the Facebook page. You can promise that you will listen, believe, do. One of the things that we have done is produce these wristbands, which are bilingual as well, if you want to learn the Welsh for these. I have just a few with me today, and I really don't want to carry them home. So please come see me if you would be willing to have your photograph taken with these on as well. Great, I can post that. But if not, I just really want people to get the message out there. So please do spread the message to other people.
Ruth, thank you. Thank you for putting to bed the myth of researchers living in ivory towers, not doing meaningful research that makes a difference to people's lives. That was absolutely fascinating on many levels. And just to say, I've got mine already. So I will expect to see you all with a listen, believe and do wristband and join in.